Welcome everyone to Bible study at Concordia San Antonio for our continuing series Following to the Cross, Mark chapters 11 through 16. My name is Dr. Jeff Cloa. Thanks for joining me again this week as we continue this journey to the cross during this Lenten season, following in detail the text of the Gospel according to Mark. We're in Mark chapter 13 for the second half of this kind of two-part mini-segment. And I'll give you kind of a primer on what we covered last week. But if you haven't seen last week's session on prophecy and the structure of Mark 13, I encourage you to go take a look at that. The outline of chapter 13 I've laid out on the screen for you. You'll notice as we read through this that there are 6 distinct kind of subsections within this chapter, and we'll cover each of these kind of on its own terms. And again, I want us to pay attention to what is being described, when does Jesus describe it as being about to occur, or when it would occur, and especially, has it already occurred? So when Jesus is speaking in say 30 AD, what happened after then that relates to what is described in that section. So the first section, verses 5 through 8. And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains." Now, a couple things to notice here. First of all, nothing on that list is particularly uncommon. You see things like people claiming to be he, that is, the promised one, the Messiah, the fulfillment of the prophetic promises. This had been happening generation after generation as people looked for the fulfillment of God's promises, and as we'll see, it was happening after Jesus' day, including, we won't go into detail here, but including places in the book of Acts where people claim to be connected with Jesus, but in fact were not. But the other items are pretty obvious. Rumors of wars, earthquakes, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines. Nothing on that list is anything that wasn't even happening during Jesus' own day as he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, and didn't happen immediately after Jesus' death and resurrection, and still continue today. So that's a pretty obvious example of a prediction, a prophecy that has a near fulfillment, even a present day fulfillment, and something that could be distant and far away. So it's not giving us a whole lot yet, and if you kind of look at it this way, Jesus is just kind of getting warmed up, if you want to put it that way. Now, I do want to take us back to Josephus, because again, these kind of things were happening within the generation, that is 40 years after Jesus spoke the words. So, and there's a lot of text here. If you want to pause and read all through it, you can. But I'll point out a couple of things. When the rebellion happened in Judea and Galilee against the Romans, actually at first it was successful. This was in 66 AD, so again about 35 years after Jesus. And of course it was about taxation. Revolts are always about money, right? Taxation. And it was actually successful. There was a battle against the Roman troops, which the Jewish rebels succeeded. They slaughtered 6,000 Roman soldiers in one battle in 66. and even seized the Roman standards, the sign of the Roman army, the sign of the Roman Empire, and consolidated power. So it wasn't a minor skirmish, and the Romans then decided they had to do something. They brought the army down from Syria, where the main army was stationed, and started to clean out, if you will, Galilee. And in pretty short order, Galilee had been reconquered in 66, heading on into 67, which meant that all the rebels who survived went down to Jerusalem to kind of make that the holdout. That was the most likely place to be able to have a fortified location. And so all these people who were not normally associated with Jerusalem and didn't live in Jerusalem went down there, and now you had just a mess. This is where you get the kind of factions and divisions of kind of one side for the Romans, one side against the Romans. As you recall, when we talked about Palm Sunday, when people came down to Jerusalem for the festivals like Passover, they would camp out on the hillsides and come into the city for certain things, going to the temple for certain things. Well, now imagine that's going on all the time. And from 67 on, you have this essentially independent, rebellious nation centered in Jerusalem, but with a mix of people who, although they're related religiously, have very different perspectives politically and don't get along with each other. The Romans, meanwhile, are having their own problems, political issues, who's going to be the emperor. Domitian goes back to Rome, and essentially operations cease. Military operations cease in Judea for the next 3 years. Domitian becomes emperor, and at that point, Titus, his son, is appointed the general of the army, and he comes back kind of with a vengeance. And now the factions, all centered in Jerusalem, have to figure out how to defend that against Rome, and should they surrender the city, should they not? And so Josephus, again, is describing these factions within Jerusalem, either aligned with or not aligned with Rome. And so he talks about a false prophet who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get upon the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. So again, notice, here's Josephus describing people in Jerusalem looking to God's deliverance at the temple, just like we saw on Palm Sunday. But here, they're expecting God's deliverance to be a massive show of force to get rid of the Romans and save the temple, save Jerusalem, and save the nation. Jesus, when he came into Jerusalem, as you recall, came in, looked around, walked out, because he has a different kind of kingdom. And we'll see how that unfolds over the next couple of weeks. But notice the language Josephus uses, false prophet. Later on, you see he talks about seducer. So when such a seducer makes him believe that he shall be delivered from those miseries which oppress him, then it is that the patient, full of hope of such, his deliverance, well, I lost the rest of the text, is deceived. So false prophets being described shortly after the time of Jesus. And again, focused on the temple in Jerusalem. So part 1, verses 5 through 8 are describing events that all unfold really from the day Jesus speaks down through the next decades and on into the present day. There was another Jewish revolt against Rome in 135 AD. Same kind of thing happens. A guy rises up, says that he's the fulfillment of the promises. They throw Rome off for a couple of years, and then Rome comes back, and it's not a pretty sight. So, again, verses 5 through 8, things that will happen in the near future. In fact, happen all the time. Second section, verses 9 through 13. Now, notice Jesus will not be speaking about the world in general, but he'll be speaking specifically about the church. Verse 9, be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils. You will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to speak or are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and father to his child, and the children will rise against parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now that's a pretty grim warning. And I've hinted a couple of times that throughout the Gospel of Mark, there are references to the church being persecuted. And Mark, as he writes his Gospel sometime after Jesus' lifetime, seems to be particularly interested in things that relate to those who are suffering persecution. And in fact, those who might have failed in persecution. So he focuses on and reminds them of Jesus' words here of what to do in the face of persecution. Notice again, this is a description of a sign for what will happen during this generation. That is, within, according to the way the Old Testament describes things, the generation being 40 years, what will happen in the lifetime of the disciples, the near future. You will be before governors and kings. You will be hauled before the synagogues. Verse 9, we see fulfilled numerous times in the book of Acts. We see Peter hauled before the authorities in Jerusalem, and he gives a gospel witness. We see Paul again and again and again hauled before city officials in the Roman Empire. I mean, take your pick, Philippi, go down the list. Acts chapter 16. Or in Acts 24:25, before Festus. He appeals to Rome and is on his way to Rome for trial when the book of Acts ends. So what is described here, in fact, we see described in the book of Acts, all of which unfolds between the ascension of Jesus and the end of Paul's life sometime around 63 or so AD during persecution under Nero. So again, what is one generation? It's essentially the time span of the book of Acts. What about the gospel being preached to all nations? Well, that's actually the point of Pentecost. That's the point of the entire book of Acts. You see in Acts 1 verse 8, you will be my witnesses beginning in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And what do we see happening in the book of Acts? Paul ends up taking the gospel and the church to the center of the universe, Rome, from which it will go out to all the nations. All the nations here, meaning all the peoples, not every political entity, but every people group. And so, again, this is all being described as unfolding in the book of Acts, within one generation of Jesus. So when did this begin to happen? Well, in a very real way, it started to happen to Jesus just 2 days from when he's speaking these words. They also started happening to the disciples, well, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when they fail, and on afterward, after Jesus' resurrection, into the book of Acts, when all these things start happening to them. Peter, James, John, all of them in the book of Acts. Well, John is not described specifically, but Peter and James, both described as giving testimony before rulers. So again, verses 9 through 13 describing present day and near fulfillment kinds of things, but also a word for us, because the church continues to do these things, to have these things happen to us. Perhaps not so much in America, but certainly around the world, these things are happening, even today. You will be hauled before rulers. The gospel must be preached to all nations. Do not worry beforehand what you will say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And generation after generation after generation have given examples of the martyrs who have done exactly that. And that would be a wonderful session to go through. Examples, even in our own context, within our own lifetimes. Things happening in Ethiopia, or goodness, the Coptic Christians slaughtered by ISIS just a couple of years ago, live on YouTube, solely because they were literally people of the cross. If you remember the graphic that was put on the screen by ISIS, incredible, simply because they're Christian. And a reminder to us of how people have stood firm, have confessed the faith, and a reminder that we ourselves might be called to do the same. Perhaps in small ways, perhaps in ways as dramatic as what might be put on a YouTube channel for propaganda. So again, persecution. Jesus is giving his disciples and us both a warning and a promise. The Holy Spirit will speak the good news through us. That's what we've been given to do. Section 3, verses 14 through 23. And now things start to kind of zoom in again back into the situation in Judea and around Jerusalem. And there's a couple specific phrases that Jesus pulls out to connect directly to the temple in Jerusalem. A key one is verse 14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, it's kind of awkward English, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, kind of a parenthetical comment, then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now that's pretty specific, right? Both the phrase abomination of desolation, which only occurs one other time in the Bible, very specific phrase we'll get to in a second, and also notice he is speaking to those who are in Judea. He's not talking now to you or me. We're not in Judea. He is speaking to those in Judea. Now, the link here that Jesus intentionally quotes comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 11. Let me read through this. Daniel here is giving, again, prophecy. Somewhat near future, sometimes distant future, but often what seems to be pretty near, within a century or two. So here in Daniel 11, forces from him, we won't worry about who him is right now, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, get that phrase now, the holy fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. So you're talking about the temple. This is the temple. And they will set up, there's this phrase, the abomination of desolation. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. And those who have insight among the people, catch that phrase, insight among the people, sort of sounds like let the reader understand, right? A little link back to this passage in Daniel. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. that they will fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder for days, that is, for an extended period of time. Now, when did Daniel's prophecies happen? Well, let's turn back to our new friend, Josephus. That phrase, where it is not permitted or where it is not lawful, is not a reference to, kind of the political legal system, but a reference to what is according to the law, according to the Torah, according to God's commandments. And that is, well, the temple, right? The first and greatest commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And the event where this comes to fulfillment happens in the temple in Jerusalem during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, sorry for tossing a new name at you, but Antiochus Epiphanes is a Greek who's an heir of Alexander the Great's generals. So Alexander the Great, 300 BC, runs over the whole world, gets this huge empire, dies without any heirs, and his generals split up the kingdoms. Antiochus is the heir, now 150 years later, still controlling a large amount of territory, and these kingdoms are kind of fighting against each other. And Judea, of course, is a place where there's always fighting because it's surrounded by powerful regions, wealthy regions, and so Antiochus and his kingdom gets control of this area and kind of establishes his presence. Antiochus dates 215 to 164 BC, so we're a couple hundred years before Jesus here, but we're now several hundred years after the time of the prophet Daniel. And the key event which really set a lot of things in motion that were still playing out in Jesus' day among the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem was his desecration of the temple in 167 BC. Now, Antiochus thought an awful lot of himself. Don't want to take too much time, but we'll just show you a picture. There's a coin with Antiochus on it, and he gave himself the name Epiphanes. Epiphanes in Greek means light is upon him. Light is upon him. So he definitely thought he was pretty significant, and like on the coin there, Nikkei, he's the conqueror. He's and you see on the what side are you looking on here? Let me put this up. If you see on the left side of the coin, you can see in Greek Epiphanu. That's the surname that he gave himself. Antiochus, the light bringer, the conquering one. This guy really thought a lot of himself. So much so that he didn't think he needed to respect the traditions or religious practices of his subjects. He just was going to do what he was going to do. Now, the events of 167 BC, when Antiochus desecrated the temple, are described in the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is basically a history book of the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus, that is, the Jewish revolt against the Greek ruler Antiochus, which resulted from his desecration of the temple in 167. And this was actually successful. From this point on, the Jewish people were autonomous for about 100 years until Rome came with Pompey in 63 BC. But the destruction of the temple was a decisively tragic event, which is still commemorated. Tisha B'Av is still a solemn observance, a day of fasting for observant Jews, which commemorates both the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians in 586 and this event in 167 BC and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. But I'm not going to go read through Second Maccabees. You can Google it if you don't have a Bible that includes the Apocrypha, which is part of the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox kind of extended canon. The upshot is Antiochus was just a nasty guy, and he took swine, which are unclean animals according to the Torah, and sacrificed swine on the altar, set up a statue of Zeus inside the temple. So, I mean, that's breaking pretty much every commandment in the book. And the response from the Jewish people was complete rebellion. And his death in 164 BC was seen as God's judgment, naturally, on his impiety and his mocking of God. So the phrase abomination of desolation in the book of Daniel, which predicts these events that happen in the temple in 167 BC, are very much in people's minds in Jesus' day, some roughly 200 years later. They all know about Antiochus Epiphanes. They all know about the desecration of the temple. They all know about the abomination of desolation. And so when Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing, or is not lawful, well, we saw this happen, the disciples are thinking, 200 years ago, and now we're looking at the temple, and you're telling us it's going to happen again, and that those who are in Judea should flee to the mountains when this happens. Well, what happens in 70 AD when the Romans kind of get their act together? They send Titus back to Judea with the proper armed forces, and they pretty much just blow things out from there. They get to Jerusalem. There's kind of a relatively short siege, and then Titus lays waste. But what does Titus do? Titus, keep in mind, Roman general. Titus was deeply affected, and again, Josephus is a propagandist. He is essentially in the employ of Titus, so he's going to try to make him look good, even though he's, well, as we'll see, desecrating the temple. So Titus was deeply affected with this state of things and reproached John and his party, and said to them, John is the kind of zealot holding out against Rome. Have not you, vile wretches that you are, by our permission, put up this partition wall before your sanctuary? Have not you been allowed to put up the pillars thereto belonging at due distances, and on it to engrave in Greek and in your own letters this prohibition, that no foreigner should go beyond that wall, which in fact the Romans allowed to happen, that the court of the Gentiles was where Gentiles could go, but beyond this point, no one was permitted, not even the Roman officials? Titus again, have not we given you leave to kill such as go beyond it, as though he were a Roman? And what do you do now, you pernicious villains? You trample upon dead bodies in this temple. So the point Josephus wants to make is that the temple had been profaned by these rebels who used it as a kind of a safe house and a fortress against the Romans. They were slaughtered inside that place. And so their dead bodies, of course, a corpse is an unclean thing according to the Levitical commands. And so the rebels themselves desecrated the temple. Now, Josephus does go on to admit that now, since Caesar, and he calls him Caesar because after the Jewish wars, after Titus is victorious, he does go on to become emperor, and so Josephus is writing now when he's emperor, and he calls him Caesar. So now, since Caesar was no way able to restrain the enthusiastic fury of the soldiers, and the fire proceeded on more and more, he went into the holy place of the temple with his commanders, and saw it with what was in it, and just stopped there. Now you have a Roman general going into the Holy of Holies in the temple which according to Leviticus again, is permitted only to the priest, the chief priest, and only one day a year on the Day of Atonement. So there's kind of a double abomination of desolation going on here in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And I'm describing all this so that we can look back at what Jesus is saying in 30 AD, 31, and see that what he said is being unfolded within a generation of his own day, both with the desecration of the temple and with the warning for those who are in Judea to flee to the mountains. What Jesus is describing here has already happened, long before our time, but it's already happened. What ended up happening to the city, stone upon stone, as you saw Jesus said, well, the green there, when he entirely demolished the rest of the city and overthrew its walls, well, he left a couple of towers as a monument of his good fortune. And actually the foundations of those two towers are still standing in the ancient city of Jerusalem. So Titus wanted people coming after him to see at least something of what he left to demonstrate his ability to overthrow everything else, right? It's like you leave a little signature to show your mighty power. Point being again, what Jesus said would happen, one stone not left upon another, unfolded within 40 years of the time he spoke the words. This event of Titus conquering Jerusalem and carrying off its riches as spoil is actually commemorated in Titus's Arch in the city of Rome. You can go see it today. And it's a very famous scene. Inside the arch is this very vivid depiction. You can see the menorah, large menorah from the temple, being carried off by the Roman soldiers. And yeah, it was destroyed. They just took everything. And Titus claimed this as a major victory. And it's historical fact. The Temple of Herod was destroyed by Titus in 70 AD in a way that looks very similar to what Jesus describes in Mark chapter 13. Now, again, I'm pointing all this out to help us understand how Jesus is preparing us to be ready for the last day, which in many ways is linked to and looks similar to other events that have unfolded since Jesus' own day. Now, 24 to 27 of Mark chapter 13, Jesus kind of zooms out again. It's not so specific as what we see in Judea or what he describes in Judea, but now it becomes kind of cosmic again, kind of this prophetic, distant future language. So, Mark 13, in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling down from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Now, that sounds pretty drastic. Again, he's drawing upon the language of the prophets. Isaiah 13 has almost exactly the same words. We saw this last week. Joel chapter 2 has almost exactly the same words. But I want to point out something that's, I think, unfortunately often overlooked. That even within the Gospel of Mark, these things actually happen. So only a few days later, we turn to Mark chapter 16, or Mark 15, and when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Notice, the sun will be darkened. What happens 2 chapters later? The sun is darkened. Powers shaken, powers in the heavens be shaken? Well, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Notice from the top, from the heavens down to the bottom, there's a reason it's described that way, as we'll see in chapter 15. And when the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that in this way Jesus breathed his last, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." So even within Mark's own gospel, even a few days later, the events of 24 to 27 begin to be unfolded. That is, this is not talking only about some last day. It's talking about things that are happening even in the present, which give us a reminder of what the ultimate last day will be like. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the heavens will be shaken. The next passage that I want to focus on here is another one that is unfortunately often misinterpreted and seen to be some kind of a future-only last day prediction. It's verse 26. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And I know you certainly have pictured in your head Jesus, kind of surfing on the clouds on this escalator down from the heavens for Judgment Day. However, just like Jesus was referring to the book of Daniel when he talks about the abomination of desolation, he's also referring to the book of Daniel in this passage precisely. Daniel 7:13 to 14. Daniel is seeing his visions. He says, "Behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed." Now, what you should have noticed in that first part is which direction is the Son of Man going? In the book of Daniel, the Son of Man is going up to the Ancient of Days, who is seated in glory in the clouds. And he is presented before him, and he is acknowledged as the one who has all glory and power and dominion, and peoples of every nation, tribe, language, and tongue will honor him. It sounds very much like the scene in the book of Revelation, which also draws upon Daniel 7. But again, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. The Greek there is very precise, very much like what we have in Daniel 7. And it's describing not Jesus coming down, but Jesus going up in glory. Now, of course, when did this happen? Now, Mark's Gospel, as we'll see at the end of our study here in a few weeks, doesn't end with the post-resurrection stories. It has a resurrection, but doesn't have the post-resurrection stories that you have in Luke and John and Matthew, and then on into the book of Acts. But in Luke's Gospel and in the book of Acts, how does the story end? Well, Jesus goes up, and he receives dominion and power and glory. He has an everlasting kingdom, one that is no longer confined to his earthly ministry, but with the Ancient of Days, with the Father in heaven. So what Jesus is describing in verse 26 is not the last day, but what happens after his crucifixion, after the seeming loss, the seeming conclusion of his story continues on because he said it would. So again, when Jesus says something is going to happen, what happens? The disciples heard him talk about a fig tree, it happened. They heard him talking about stones, they're worried about when it's going to happen. Now Jesus is planting other things for them to watch out for. And one of them is that he will be ascended to the throne of glory. And it doesn't happen in Mark's gospel, but it does happen. And his disciples, as you see in the book of Acts, start to figure it out, especially once we get to Pentecost. So again, verse 24 to 27, not a sign exclusively of the end times, but a sign of things that will happen before this generation passes away, and which happened, in fact, just 40 days after Jesus' resurrection. So I know we're kind of moving a little slowly through this section, but man, this is important stuff. Okay. What happens next in verse 27? He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. And again, if we think this is about the last day, we think this is only about what's going to happen on Judgment Day. And that is the case. That is what's described elsewhere in the Bible about the last day. But here it's talking about things that are unfolding before this generation passes away. There's a little play on words here, and in English we can't pick up on this, but the word angel is simply an English word based on the Greek word angelos, which means messenger. And sometimes they're heavenly messengers, which we picture in our minds as angels. So the angel Gabriel is the messenger Gabriel who's sent from God to give messages to Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary and all those, right? But it's also a messenger. And messengers aren't always heavenly messengers. Sometimes they're just people. And who are the messengers who bring out the good news and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven? Well, these are the apostles and the church throughout the book of Acts, who goes out and brings the good news to all peoples. Again, Acts 1 verse 8. You will be my witnesses beginning in Jerusalem and Judea, into Samaria, and onto the ends of the earth. It's happening and has already happened and continues to happen in our own day as we bring that good news to all peoples. So to wrap this up, verses 5 through 27 are primarily about God's deliverance and restoration of his people, that is, the believers, and concurrent judgment on the nations, that is, on unbelief. This is a theme, as we saw last week, for the day of the Lord. And as we saw last week, there are multiple days of the Lord that foreshadow and help us understand what the final day of the Lord is like. We saw this in the Old Testament. Isaiah talked about day of the Lord. Ezekiel talked about day of the Lord. All of those happened. And all of those give us an understanding of what the ultimate last day of the Lord will be like. But here in Mark chapter 13, they're functioning in a very specific way for the generation of the apostles, the disciples who were sitting at Jesus' feet, who needed to know what would be coming in the days ahead. Jesus is preparing his church for what would come, including for the church going all the way back to the first days, all the way back to those first disciples. Jesus is preparing them. And these signs, he calls them signs, in verses 5 through 27, are all things that happen in Jesus' life and ministry. They all happen in his death and resurrection and glorification. And they all happen within a generation of when Jesus speaks these words, looking at the temple. And at the same time, as the prophets have always done, when they talk about present day and near day events, they always do so in terms of that ultimate future event when God brings about his final act of deliverance and restoration on the last day. And this is important for us to recognize because it teaches us to trust God's promises. It teaches us to trust God's words. Because when he says it will happen, it happens. And we who live 2,000 years later can look back at the historical record and say, oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that happened. Oh, and by the way, there's a couple things that haven't yet happened. How do we prepare ourselves for that? When Jesus says something is going to happen, what happens? How do we keep watch, is the point. How do we hold all these together until that one final greatest day comes into clear focus? So, I'm going to skip over this and focus on that last section, verse 30. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And as we've seen, they did. Within one generation, all those things, including the stones, took place. Why is Jesus pointing this out? Well, the payoff is verse 31. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. That is, my words will not go empty. My words will not be without consequence. My words are not to be disregarded. What Jesus is simply saying is, my word is more substantial. My word is more permanent and eternal than heaven and earth itself. Think about that. His word is more permanent and substantial and foundational than heaven and earth itself. Right? Verbum Dei Mana in Eternum, that phrase from the Psalms, the word of God endures forever. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. His word endures forever. When Jesus says something is going to happen, what happens? Well, now we get to talk about the end times. So I grabbed a random graphic off of Google. There's Nostradamus and nuclear war and, I guess 2021, who knows? Could be. It didn't happen in 2020. Maybe it's 2021. Well, what does Jesus actually say? What does he talk about regarding the end times, the last day? The key takeaway again, let's just read through it. Concerning that day, when heaven and earth will pass away, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard. Keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts the servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, because you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all. Well, the ESV has stay awake. The word is actually watch, right? Be ready. Be prepared. Be on alert. Stay awake. Now, a couple things about this. Jesus has already given similar warnings. You recall in Mark chapter 12, the parable of the vineyard, you had the master who rented the land to farmers, and when it was the right time, he came back expecting a harvest. And what did he find? Well, he found people who were not ready, who chose to do their own thing with the land that had been entrusted to them. It didn't turn out very well, of course, for the tenants. And the religious leaders knew that Jesus had spoken this parable against them. So Jesus has already given this warning. Keep watch. Be faithful. When the owner of the vineyard comes looking for fruit, give him the fruit. It's not that hard, right? It's his. And by the way, he's letting you keep most of it because he's created this for you, right? Just give him the fruit. It's not that hard. Well, of course it is, but that's the point, right? What does it mean to keep watch? Well, part of it means to bear fruit. Part of it means to give what is due to the Lord, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. But keep going. Is it going to happen in the evening or at midnight? Keep in mind, he's speaking to 12 disciples who are looking at the temple on the Mount of Olives with him. And what's going to happen in just 2 nights? He's going to tell his disciples to watch and pray. And 3 times he goes away to pray and comes back, and what does he find the disciples doing? Sleeping. And what happens when there's a threat of persecution, when they're hauled or the threat of being hauled before rulers? Well, they all run away. They all fail. And this interesting little comment about when the rooster crows. Don't pass over that too quickly, because this is kind of a double whammy. In the Last Supper in Mark 14, Jesus is going to warn Peter that he's going to deny him before the rooster crows 3 times. And Peter says it ain't going to happen. And what happens after they flee from the garden and Peter follows and goes to the courtyard? He denies him 3 times, and he hears the rooster crow. Right? He's planting seeds so Peter can be ready, so we can be ready, so we can watch, so we can do what he's called us to do. And so the whole point of this is to watch, to be ready. Jesus is not giving these signs of what will happen in the next generation or this teaching on the last day so that we can figure it out. He flat out says, you're not going to figure it out. Nobody knows the day or the hour. And he throws in this little kind of hyperbole, right? I don't even know the day or the hour, right? It's of course he's divine. He knows all things. But in his human nature, he puts on this humility and doesn't use his divine prerogatives. But the point he's actually making is nobody knows. You're not going to figure it out. So don't waste your time trying to figure it out. I'm giving you all you need. I'm giving you my word. I'm giving you my promises. I'm giving you myself. All I'm asking you to do is to trust. Is to trust what I am doing, to trust what I am promising. Watch. So I'll leave you with a few ideas for reflection and devotion. First, to recall that God's judgment on unbelief is real. It's historical. We see it in the prophets. We see it in Jesus. When people reject God and his mercy, his covenant, his love, end result is they are outside of his love. God's judgment has happened. It's historical. And so the warning for us is, well, watch, right? Trust. Continue to trust in the one who keeps his promises. And, well, I guess that's the second point. God's deliverance is real and historical. That comment about when those who are in Judea, or those in Judea should flee to the mountains, there's actually church tradition in the early church that this is exactly what the early Christians did. They saw the signs, they knew what was coming when the rebellion happened, and they simply left. They left Jerusalem, they left Judea, and they went out. They went north. And the church continued to thrive among the nations. But the church didn't exist, at least in any significant way, from the end of Jerusalem in 70 AD until Constantine and his mother in the early 4th century, and they went back and kind of reestablished Jerusalem as a center for Christian worship, and it is still to this day. In fact, Bethlehem and Church of the Nativity and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, all those have been on the same spot for 1,700 years. But for the preceding 250 years before those were reestablished, essentially nothing that we can tell in Jerusalem and Judea as far as Christianity. Third point. What Jesus says will happen happens. I think I belabored this enough. Again, Jesus is the final prophet. He's the ultimate prophet who is promised. And his words will not pass away. So, as the old prayer says, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest his words. Take them to heart. Trust them. Bind them on your foreheads. Write them on your hearts. All those phrases from throughout the Bible. His words will not pass away. And so I encourage you, just read, right? Read his word. Trust his word. He's laid out and kept his promises. He's been faithful. And he's given us this word to give us sustenance day by day until he comes again. So how do we stay ready? Well, again, Jesus told us already in chapter 8, verse 34 and 35. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What can a man give in return for his soul? But the promise, whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's, and that word, will save it. But this is not the end of the story. And I hope you've tracked along and stayed for this final payoff. Because we saw Peter fail. Even though he heard Jesus 2 days before tell him what would happen. Peter failed. But what did Jesus do to Peter? He kept his promise. You and I will fail. We've already failed. We will continue to fail. But Jesus did not fail. He kept his word. He kept his promise. He went to the cross. The sun was darkened. He did rise from the dead, just as he said. He did ascend to the Ancient of Days and has been enthroned in power and glory and reigns over all nations. And his grace and his mercy has no limits. He comes to us constantly in His love. And we can rely on that love and forgiveness because He is faithful, always. And He's given us His word to continue to lead and guide us. So thanks for trekking through all this. I pray blessings on your study of His word and your keeping watch day by day until He comes again. Peace be with you.